You're listening to the Product Coalition podcast with Jay Stansel. This is where product mastery happens. This is where careers are made. Welcome to the Product Coalition podcast. Let's go.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Product Coalition podcast. This is the home of conversations with the world's most forward-thinking product leaders. Today, we're joined by someone who doesn't just talk about the future of operations, he's building it. Chris Butler is a chaotic good product manager. He's a writer and speaker whose career spans leadership roles at Microsoft, Waze, Kayak, Meta, Cognizant, Google, and now GitHub, where he leads product operations for the Synapse team. He's also the founder of Liminal Practice and a driving force behind the Near Future Laboratories design fiction projects, where he helps organizations imagine and prepare for futures most of us haven't even begun to consider. Now, Chris has been at the forefront of AI and automation in operations, championing responsible AI, pioneering decision-making models, and he's been rethinking how strategy gets translated into execution. Chris has been recognized as the best product person, a ones to watch in product-led growth as well, and he's a mentor, a writer, and an educator, shaping how the next generation of product leaders think. So in this episode, we're going deep into the work that Chris has been leading, from reimagining organizational design to unlocking the power of automation in product operations to help us all grapple with those ethical, strategic, and human questions that AI is now forcing us to face. So this isn't going to be a conversation about what if. With Chris, we're going to get what now and what's next, and I can't wait to share this with you. Chris, welcome to the podcast. So good to have a moment with you today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me. It definitely sounds like I've been doing a lot based on everything you just read. So thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure, Chris. I was excited to jump into this conversation. It's not one I've had on the show before. But before we get into the nuts and bolts around this future of operations work, can I ask, why is this space a space that you're passionate about talking to audiences about?
Well, so, I mean, I would say usually call myself a product manager. Like that's kind of the way I think about myself, even though I've had roles the last couple of times that are more focused on operations. I think that what I started to see inside of the teams was that the way that we actually did the work had a huge impact on the outcomes that we ended up having. And so that meant not only like, how do we actually have the cross-functional team discussion, but also just the way that the organization is set up, the way the organization makes decisions. And so for me, product operations is really about this idea that we're no longer just saying that things will just kind of figure themselves out when it comes to decision-making, sharing information, communication flows, bottleneck issues, things like that. But we're going to be very kind of intentional in the way that we start to address these problems, monitor them, and then create solutions. And so I think AI is going to have a huge impact on all of these things because, and in particular, this goes back to kind of the team that I'm leading right now called Synapse inside of GitHub is part of the product operations organization. And our mission is really to reduce toil for the EPD, which is kind of the cross-functional engineering product design teams within GitHub. And so we're working on a bunch of different things that are trying to address that toil, but it's essentially like there are operational inefficiencies that we find, and sometimes they kind of just sit there and fester, and we don't really do anything about them until it's like a fire. And so we're trying to take a much more proactive approach to say there's these new tools that are going to help us do an awful lot of things to take away drudgery and toil inside of these roles and help make people be more effective at their roles. And so how and where we do that is actually something we need to discover still. And so this is a role that is a lot about kind of like process automation, fixing things that we see as problems, but also kind of experimenting a lot with, we don't know how AI should be integrated into these different workflows that people have. We haven't seen what is kind of the best way to do that, and what are some of the downfalls, right? I think the separation between human and machine decision-making, right? I think only humans can really make decisions, but machines can do a lot of things automatically. I think we need to figure out where those kind of borders are, and maybe what is the nuance that's required when starting to implement these things.
Okay. I'm looking forward to going deeper into all of this with you today, Chris. But before we do that, I mentioned you described yourself as the chaotic good product manager. What's driving that label for you, and how has that mindset shaped the way you're leading product operations at GitHub?
Well, I think, one of my mottos is that we are wrong today, we just don't know how yet. And so from that perspective, what I've found to be really helpful is really keeping an open, curious mind, and one that actually leverages randomness to help us do a better job. And so chaotic good is really just meant to point to the fact that, well, I want to like look through all of the possibilities of something and not always be kind of, I guess, limited by my own biases. And so that the chaos, I think, really helps me expand what I end up considering. And good just is that I'm here to try to help people. In general, that means either teams making great products or making great products myself. But in the end, it's to actually help move forward the way that people do things. And I think actually one of the biggest problems that we deal with in today's world is actually that people are too certain about things. And I would say pretty much all of the worst things that happen in the world are because people are certain rather than leveraging the uncertainty of the world. And it's a little bit of an Easter egg as well for kind of the Dungeons and Dragons nerds that are out there. It's also a alignment for characters inside the Dungeons and Dragons game as well. And so I, as in addition to like some like short science fiction writing, I actually, do a lot of. I'm actually writing a module for a role playing game called Mothership right now too. And so I find these like creative outlets as very satisfying. But I think role playing games are actually interesting because they're kind of like facilitating a shared story between people. And I think using those types of skills inside of meetings, inside of discussions and decision making, I think can be really helpful as well. So I see there's a little bit of like a work related aspect to the Dungeons and Dragons that I used to play a long time ago.
Nice. Chris, it sounds to me that what we're going to be talking about today is really, in your experience, you've PM'd the PM experience. So as we start to talk in the future of operations of work and processes and automations, before we go into that, what are some of these sort of foundational principles that you're starting with when you're starting a role like where you are at GitHub before you even get into the work?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I tend to fall back on qualitative research an awful lot because that's something that I've done as actually a consultant, but also I find it really powerful in building my own understanding of a problem. And so what I mean by that is that like the underlying principle is that people are doing things a way today type of problem. If you look at something like Job to Be Done, it kind of says that they're cobbling together their own solutions in some way based on the things that are available to them. And our job is to really learn like, what is this end goal and the frictions that they end up having to be able to achieve something. And so to me, the PM experience is really that I think an awful lot about my work as being a product manager for the experience of the team. And so that means I do an awful lot of qualitative user research. I go and observe people doing their work. And in fact, even just like lurking inside of Slack channels or reading Google Docs that people are pulling together about how something is done, I think actually points to really what are they trying to get done, but also like how are they going about it. And so from that information, we start to pull together like what are some really key problems that people are doing that they're kind of hitting over and over again that either causes them mental kind of overhead, context switching, or even things that just kind of are hard for them to do well. And taking those and then starting to experiment really quickly with here's like a possible solution that we could leverage with, say, using AI, and doing that type of rapid experimentation to be able to figure out like how we could solve this problem for them in some way. So that tends to be like the principles that I use is really just like a product manager would with like product, except my customers are actually internal to the organization. Like even John Cutler, he had a great post where he was talking about how product ops teams are really more like internal platform teams. And I tend to agree with him. Like what we're building is infrastructure. Now, just recently, we did actually open source some of the work that we did. So we're trying to help actually people out in the community as well, like open source maintainers or other types of people. And so we're trying to actually provide that information externally as well. But our real goal is to help solve the problems for the people inside of GitHub. And I think that's what's actually kind of important too, is that yes, you can solve problems in a general way. And that's why there's lots of platform teams that are out there solving these types of workflow problems. But to actually make it work for your organization, you have to understand an awful lot about the culture of the organization, the individuals that are actually acting within it, and then adapting the solution for their problem. Because there's always like a nuance. There's always like a special need that's in there that like if you just like said, okay, we're just gonna use the default of like Jira or whatever, right? Like or projects even within GitHub, like it's not going to solve the exact problem that your organization is dealing with, which is self-made in some ways, right? Like that's another interesting thing about product operations is that a lot of the time, I would say the hardest thing I have to do as a product operations person is actually get leaders to change the way that they do things. Because I can use their kind of power inside the organization to enforce something on the team, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be better for the team. And a lot of the time there's preconceived notions about like the way the leader wants something done. And that actually causes the team to then do it that way, but it may not be the best way for the team or for the leader. And the leader just doesn't know or understand that yet because they haven't been able to think through that. Status reporting is one of the prime examples of that I've had to implement like over and over again, and they always fail. And I kind of put together a rubric about why they fail, but it's very hard to get leaders to change the way that they actually engage inside of those status reports for them to be more of a success.
Okay, we spoke there about principles, and you spoke about that early change management that's required. But before we get to that point, what are some of those leading indicators within processes that you're looking for to know when to consider adding automation into?
Yeah, I mean, anytime that someone has to write down the process for someone else to follow, or if there's ever a time that people are actually doing something over and over again, like toil itself, there's a really great definition by a Google SRE team around toil. And so it's things that are repetitive. It's things that actually don't, they don't really scale as you get bigger. They just kind of like add more work. They don't actually contribute to the end goal. They're more just kind of in service of doing this stuff. And so if they're repetitive, if they are kind of bothersome or annoying, if they these are all things that we need to look for as far as signals. And so one example of that, when we talk about, say, like status reporting, one of the things we see, and I've seen in every organization, is basically that people spend a lot of time pulling this information together. And so identifying the fact that there's many different people that are kind of like doing this work, it is causing the disruption in them doing the actual value added work, which is usually building a product. But there is value in it, right? Status reporting is really about communication flows. And so seeing how communication doesn't flow as easily as it should, it doesn't get to the right people, and that leaders are not actually understanding what's going on, I think ends up being like a super important thing for us to identify, because of that fact that you can see the toil inside of that work. So that's what I'd say. It's like, I think there's a lot of signals that toil is happening within an organization, and those are the things that you should really be focusing on.
Often, Chris, culture and processes interwoven for various different reasons. When you're working with teams or assessing teams or researching teams, like you spoke earlier about your qualitative approach, what comes up in terms of fear from a change management perspective? That something's going to be automated and therefore I'm 1 point less valuable than I was yesterday because of the automation. And how do you address that fear culturally?
I mean, I think that there's the fear of automation actually comes up for the things that we find meaningful inside of our jobs. I would say that a lot of the time, the toilsome work, I would call it like BS work, if you want to call it that. But the idea of like this work that people don't want to do, they generally want to automate it. And the reason why is because a lot of the time they end up being so focused on kind of the aspect of this work that it kind of crowds out more like longer term thinking, strategic thinking, kind of deeper thinking. And so I would say that most of the time people are not afraid of actually automating busy work, right? Or not busy work, but like toilsome work that is not actually aiding them in doing a better job. But I would say that like when you start to automate away something that actually helps them do their job better, or they find meaningful in their job. Like I was at a company called Philosophy, which was like a boutique design consultancy. And we were doing a project for Google and PwC around field service operations, which is basically like repair people that go out into the world and like repair a gas station or something like that. And so when we were talking to the dispatchers about some of the work that we were trying to automate away, and this was like back in 2017. And so it was still a lot of prototyping about what AI could do at that point. The things that they understood what was happening and they didn't like tended to be the things that they found most meaningful in their jobs, which was really kind of like connecting with other humans, helping other people, understanding what is going on. And if you take away that from them, that was actually bad in some way. What they didn't want to do is they didn't want to worry about like all of the hard problems, like constraint-based scheduling, or like making sure that someone is followed up with. Like those are kind of like less helpful things that they just wish they could automate away. And so I think there is this like distinction between process automation should always be about the fact that we're trying to remove the parts that are not making the human better at what they're doing. And so maybe going back to something like status reporting, a great example of that is that, we really want senior leaders to understand what is going inside their organizations. We want them to build trust in the teams that they're doing the right things and that they're intervening, the leaders are intervening when appropriate. And then they want to know when they should intervene, right? And so all of that, like, if you just summarize a status report and then you just package that and send it off to the next person and they summarize the status report automatically, send it off to the next person, you lose all of this capability of kind of like learning and understanding and building trust and all of these like human aspects of it. And so that's where the distinction I start to think of is like, there's a bunch of things that machines are really good at that also humans really hate doing. And that's a perfect intersection of what you should be doing with process automation.
Nice. I mean, that was going to be my next question, really. But as a question, that's a fast-moving question. You talked about 2017. If I asked you then, what are machines good at? In those days, pre-LLM adoption,
it was pre-LLM and generative AI and chat really working. Like
data scientists that cost $250,000. So, where are we at right now in late 2025 with what are people versus machines good at, and where do you think we're going to be in, let's say, a really short time, 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now we've clearly models can do a really amazing job in kind of synthesizing and translating. I would call it like translating from one type of text to another, or even text to image, or text to even like a prototype type of things. Like we're still kind of in early phases for text to prototype, I would argue. But this idea of like taking some core text and some context around that and turning that into code or another synthesized piece of writing, I think that's really great right now. Like I think there's definitely the fact that people need to get better at kind of how they provide context and what they're asking these systems to do. And a lot of that can actually be helped by teams like ours, where we try to take a lot of the work away from the person to like write the perfect prompt, and more try to get them exactly what they need based on the context that they're willing to provide, essentially. So I think that's where we are right now. I think like the future of this stuff is actually right now it's kind of like a one-on-one type of use of these systems. So like I'll go in and I'll use like ChatGPT or Copilot, but it's really just me and the Copilot kind of working. And maybe some people are starting to get to the fact that they'll like spin up like 10 agents and kind of monitor them as they're doing coding and stuff like that. The time to intervention for agents is still in the range of like seconds to minutes, I would argue. If it goes longer than that, it's probably doing something wrong or bad, is what I would argue. But I think the next step is actually, how do we start to include these tools inside of our cross-functional meetings? And so one of the things we've been experimenting with the Synapse team itself is actually around kind of what we're calling mobbed kickoffs. And so like you would do a kickoff with the team, you'd bring everybody in a room, you do a couple workshop-y type of exercises, and then you come out of that meeting with kind of like, what are we going to do next, right? And this is not only the fact that we're trying to make sure everybody adds information to this process, but also that everybody understands everybody else's viewpoint, and we're kind of like building team camaraderie in some way. So there's like multiple reasons why you want to do a kickoff rather than kind of doing something on your own or doing it asynchronously independently. There's a reason to have synchronous work. And so we've started to actually include these tools. And so we have something called GitHub's packaged context to be able to like have a conversation. And we've created a bunch of different spaces. One that is called like analogous innovation, which is like, how do we look at analogy to actually help expand the way we're thinking about the problem? I have one which is we don't have a designer on our team, for example. We don't have a customer support person. And so it actually emulates different viewpoints of cross-functional team members that are maybe not there. It emulates my CPO, and based on like his previous conversations. And so inside that meeting, though, we're actually inviting these things as we'll be having a conversation. We'll kind of kick off with like, here's what we're trying to do. What does everybody think? I take that, it's a little clunky now because I have to take that transcript and then shove it into each of these different spaces. But then we like read the responses together and start to actually see, and it expands the way we think about this kickoff, right? And so I think this idea of like multiplayer uses of these tools, and even going so as far as like, we use something like Spark, which is in preview right now, which is kind of text to prototype. We actually start to kick off that, right? And we start to then kick off agents to help write documentation about what we're doing, or help us write like an initiative brief based on something called Bloom, which is really about kind of like initiative formation, feedback, and document drafting. And so using all these these kind of like tools live in the kickoff, I think is the future of a lot of this stuff. And I just gave a talk earlier this week at the O'Reilly AI Code Conf, which was all about kind of like the way that AI coding is developing. My talk was much more of kind of a future speculative, like 5-minute lightning talk that was really about like, what is this future? And I guess one of those scenes that I tried to paint and as the first scene is really, rather than, we're kind of using tools on our own on our laptop, we're actually seeing something more like a whiteboard or like a Zoom call where agents are kind of symbolized inside that Zoom call and will raise their hand or provide provocation or advice while the thing is happening. And the planning is automatically taking place and multiple prototypes are being created as straw men to be able to have a better conversation. So I think that's the future of a lot of this stuff, especially with process automation. Like I think all of these things start to take away all of the drudgery of like, how do we actually, use all the information we just talked through inside of this workshop or this kickoff is automatically generating artifacts that are helpful for us in some way.
This is fascinating, Chris, because what's coming to mind for me there is you're decentralizing decision making to the point that really you're giving your AI tools some equity in the decision making process to the point where they have an opinion. And as a group, you're respecting that opinion and you're including that in the decision making process. Can I ask where do you draw the line on that? Or have you found a line yet when it comes to ethics around processes? So for instance, what's straight to mind for me is probably more things that are HR related, that involve people's sensitive information or medical records or personal situations, etc. Where have you seen that line and where has that prompted you to have to rethink or adjust?
I mean, I think we're still trying to figure out that line. I mean, I have an opinion about where that line is. And actually, just yesterday, I was working on a prompt that I want to start including in a lot of the tools, which tries to make a clear delineation between what types of decisions humans should be making. And actually, as a prompt that will be added to these tools, it will always try to mark up a place where it says, hey, actually, I don't think this is a place that a machine should give you an opinion. Like maybe the machine can help, like for example, inside of decision making, I think of decision making, and I helped co-found this community called the Uncertainty Project, which is all about decision making and strategy. And so we kind of think about it that like there's the first step, which is like deciding how we're going to make a decision. And sometimes it's kind of set in stone, but maybe you need to have a special way of doing that. But then once you understand the problem and you then start generating options, right? I think that's a really great place where not only can machines start to help offer other options, right? It can start to mine all of the previous decisions that had been made previously and what options had been chosen or not chosen and why. It can start to then do simulation of the future and like what is possibly going to happen if we choose this particular option versus this one, and what are the possible future scenarios that are happening there. And I think that's really great for like the machine to actually help you in rounding out all of these possibilities. And I think also making sure that everybody inside the organization that needs to know and think about these options, it can probably do a better job of like, rather than just me remembering to put it on these distribution lists, it's like who actually deals with this type of problem on a regular basis. And for the options that we're considering, who has actually built options like this before, right? And so I think there's like a bunch of things like that. Now, I do think that in the end, the decision itself is actually by humans. And there's a bunch of ways you can do that. It could be one person. It could be this person is the DRI that has to make this decision. It could be consensus-based decision-making, which is we all have to agree. It could be veto-based, which is basically no one disagrees that we're going to do this. There's lots of different ways. But in the end, it's about humans coming together and there's someone or some group of people that need to make that decision. And this is where I think like when we talk about automation in general and like when we should consider not to do automation is if you as a decider of turning on this automation does not want to take responsibility for the automation itself, then it's probably a bad automation to create. Like you as the human that is creating this, if you do not think it you should not be blamed for the automation, then it's a bad automation. That's what I would argue. Because like in the end, like the decision to enable that automation is a decision in itself. Right? It may enable a bunch of other kind of automation and stuff that's happening where maybe automatic decision making is a little bit of a strong term there, but like the idea of it making a decision, I think is still a human thing, right? And so that's what I would argue is, and that's where I started to see this like difference is that also later on after we made the decision, actually helping explore the outcome and the process that took place to be able to then learn from that, and not necessarily learn from the standpoint of like, as the world becomes more and more uncertain, like as we're more interconnected in the world, as things get harder, more complex, there's a lot of uncertainty. And so that means that even if we made like a good decision-making process, we may have a bad outcome. And so we can't be over rotating on just the outcomes themselves. We have to also be looking at kind of the process by which we came to a decision. And so I think that's where I think machines can help us understand that better. And then it's us as humans where we internalize this and update our prior understanding and our experiences to help build our intuition. Because I think that's the other thing that machines don't do so well right now is that there's a lot of kind of like complex context that people have inside of our brains and inside of our like culture or community of an organization. There's a lot of experience that's inside of that, and so you can't always encode everything into one place. Even when we talk about this idea of like say writing using the idea of like writing a bunch of stuff to then create code, one of the biggest downfalls there is that you don't include what you really need to a lot of the time, because you don't include the specificity that's inside your head that's kind of implicit. And so that's why I think like it is very important for us to continue to like update our own intuition around things. And I think we're gonna start to figure out better and better, what does it mean for us to say that like the goal of the human here is to learn and decide and to orchestrate or curate, and then it's for the machine to go and do the execution in some way. So I think that's like a good separation that I've been thinking about.
Can I ask, Chris, what do you see that still remains consistent in terms of product practices, actions,
Hmm.
that is still true today as it was 10 years ago in product
Yeah.
management?
I mean, I
What are you
think,
still doing?
yeah, the idea of, I'm sorry, was that?
What are you still doing that hasn't changed over 10 years?
I would say that like writing things like initiative briefs or PRDs, like I think there's a lot of discussion right now about how it's no longer about PRDs, but it's about prototypes. And I think it's actually missing a really important point, which is that the documentation that we end up creating is about sharing context with other people. And it's about being able to then get them to engage with ideas in a way that is really helpful. And so I think that's one thing, is that like we still need to write down what we think is the right intent for the product. And that intent is kind of thinking about a future world in which, I kind of call it like product manager fiction is what I kind of call it. And so we're writing about like what we think should be in the future. And I think that being able to have that type of discussion is still very powerful and important. And I think it becomes even more important when we look at things like spec-driven development, which is kind of a new term right now, or the idea of context engineering. This is really about like, what are you curating as far as the context? And some of that you may write and then have as a durable artifact over time. Like, for example, the goals of the organization might be a really important artifact to include in the context. But then also you're going to have to write something new, which is like, here's a new intent that we are thinking about. And when I say intent here, I mean like, yeah, we want to build a new feature. And that feature is actually an intent in the future of that we want this thing to exist in this world and have this impact in the future world, right? And so that's why I kind of call it product manager fiction. It's just, unfortunately, like people tend to write it very poorly and they don't write it in a way that's very interesting. And so I think there is still that. Like, so good writing skills, I think, are going to be even more important, because we're not only communicating with other humans still, but we're also going to be using this as context for machines to then do things, right? And so I think that idea of like writing that type of document is still super important. I think also human relationships, right? Like the fact that we are constantly building up an understanding of how other people think about things is really what, like, there's a great book called oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name, but it's about reasoning. And basically their argument is that that reasoning is actually not something we do inside of our own heads. It's something that we do when communicating with other humans. And a lot of that reasoning is like trying to understand what norms are applied here, and then trying to mind read what the other person thinks, because we want to now understand, like, between the two of us, like, what is actually the gap in understanding or agreement or knowledge. And then by like in some way aligning on that, we actually create a better decision in some way. So I think that idea of like how we work with other people is still incredibly important. And people call this soft skills. I don't think that's the right thing to call it, because I would just say that like it requires lots of time to build relationships, right? Like, especially for leaders with their teams, like the most important thing that they have is actually their time. And so when they show they're spending time, like say responding to a status report, for example, it can be very, very powerful for the team, right? Like them actually taking the time to do one-on-ones versus not, right? Like all of those things show that they care about the actual organization, and they're putting their money or their time where their mouth is when it comes to that. And so I think those like that human connection and actually spending time with the other people, I think is still super important. Now, work can be very transactional sometimes, but I would argue that like for teams that are very high performing, they need to learn an awful lot about how everybody else on that team thinks and does their job, and kind of what is the perspective they bring that is super valuable. And it doesn't mean that we actually want groupthink. If anything, we want to avoid groupthink. What we want is like really, really important kind of different viewpoints that are providing tension in the team that is helpful. So the difference between product design and engineering, they're all very important, different viewpoints. I think with machines and all of the tools that are starting to happen with AI, you can add actually even more viewpoints inside of that world that might help you even make better decisions. Like if I can't always have a privacy expert in my meeting, I could at least have an agent that might simulate what a privacy expert would say. And that's super helpful, right? So anyways, I still think it's super valuable for teams to get to know each other, but I think machines actually add this other thing that you can bring in lots of different viewpoints almost automatically into your world in some way.
Chris, we're approaching the end of 2025. Many of us are writing 2026 strategies and roadmaps right now and thinking ahead. Generally speaking, when it comes to product ops or just general business operations, for those listening around the world here, what does all of this mean for strategy in 2026? If you're looking at a blank sheet on your strategy, what are you thinking of as your must-haves versus your could-haves when it comes to strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's no such thing as a blank sheet when it comes to strategy usually. Like there's a bunch of things that you're working on right now which actually point to what you think is valuable or important to do. So I think like there is the blank page problem because people are not looking at actually like how are they taking action? Like in this last week, what were the decisions that you even made? Like kind of points to what you're trying to do. But I guess if your question is like, what are some of the important things for us to focus on in 2026? I do think that experimenting with these tools, allowing people to experiment with these tools, right? And then I think having teams that are actually incentivized to build things with these tools is super important. There's a lot of different groups that are saying that they require everybody to use AI tools right now, but they're not necessarily allowing them to buy the ones that are most helpful. I think even in our case, right, like there's just a lot of kind of security and IT types of issues that we end up having because of the fact that we're a highly secure product. And so not that that's bad, but it's just it's one of those things which maybe delays the ability for us to experiment more with those types of things. And as far as like product operations, I mean, I think the basics really end up being around like action, right? Where are their sources of truth? And then how is it that you help convert kind of information into sources of truth? And those things are kind of everything that you need to worry about. And so that I've just kind of talked about like, one, like what are the tracking systems that you have? Like how do you track issues and epics and initiatives? Where are the durable artifacts for those things? How do you report on them? Like how do you show updates on them? And then how do you allow for different teams to kind of give information through like issue intake or triage? You're kind of describing everything that the team needs to deal with when it comes to operations. And so I think there's a lot of things that are, we have those work streams inside of Synapse that we're thinking about a lot for inside of GitHub. But I would say those are like evergreen problems that we need to solve. And we can always get better at them in some way. And so that's what I would say is like, that's what I'm really looking at for 2026. I mean, I think there's also this added things we just talked about as far as like decision making and where to include AI inside those decision making processes. I think like the idea of spinning up a decision channel, getting some documentation ready, deciding who needs to decide, how to decide, like generating options, and then making the decision and winding down all of that infrastructure and documenting the decision. I think those are things that just like, it's kind of as annoying as like, okay, well, I have to create a new Slack channel. And so why doesn't like a lot of this stuff just like happen just automatically, right?
Okay, Chris, I've stretched you to next year. I want to stretch you even further into let's go to 2030 now. Well, you're writing a product manager job description for this team of the future. I've got two parts to this question for you, Chris. What's something you think is going to be on that job description that today's JDs just don't mention? And what does that team of the future look like?
Yeah, I think that the people of that era are going to think much more directly about the dynamics of the team, and they're going to have tools that help show that. So, for example, like the idea of information flows around the organization, they will think and look at and understand where are their bottlenecks in information flow and why, and how do they actually end up fixing that. I think maybe putting on my like speculative design fiction hat too, I would put probably like a little warning at the bottom, which is that, in this new role, you may have agents that are trained off of your behavior, and those agents are part of the company. And so like basically if you decide to leave the company, your agent is still there working, even after you leave, right? So I think there's like things like that where what is the actual necessary part of human decision making versus what are the things that like I don't need to be there for, but based on my bias. Like, and again, when I say bias, I don't mean it always in a bad way, right? Like, I mean, there's positive, neutral, and bad bias. And actually context itself requires you to have an opinion about things. And good prompting, actually, if you have an opinion, the prompt will be much more effective in some way. So I think like the bundling of your viewpoint ends up becoming something that happens in every side of every organization. And so for me, my agent or my proxy, right, can make decisions on my behalf probably a good amount of the time, and I'm not necessarily needed for all of those decisions. So I think there's something about that idea as well.
Okay, fascinating. So for those that are feeling a little bit overwhelmed right now, Chris, around the pace of AI, what advice would you give for them of one practical thing they could be doing simply at a personal level, ignoring strategy and product ops, at a personal level, to just stay ahead and get some control back around all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would tell people to not worry about as much is that like there's just a huge number of like new models and model updates that are coming out right now. I actually don't even pay attention to them anymore because honestly, I know that they're going to get better and I know that they're going to get in some way cheaper. I mean, we're going to keep increasing the context that we include. So cost, that's another very interesting problem in question is around how cost works on this stuff. But I would just say like paying attention to like a very specific model, I don't think is as helpful. What I do think is helpful is actually, building the habit to try out these tools like say ChatGPT or Copilot when you have some type of problem, when you feel like you're kind of like you're procrastinating on something. I think when you feel that like sometimes it's a good thing to procrastinate because you're trying to actually like collect more information or you're trying to figure out what you actually want to do here. But I've often found now that when I feel this procrastination, if I just like plug in what I know right now into some type of model, it actually spits out a bunch of stuff that like, again, usually because it's in my domain of expertise, it's not perfect and it's not always 100% good, but at least gets me thinking a little bit better about how to go about something. So I think that idea of just like when you feel stuck, I use it for that. Now, it shouldn't be for things that you're not an expert in as much, right? I think like actually using these models for things where you're not an expert, I think can be helpful, but it also gives you like a undue sense of confidence in those things. And so I think that's maybe the thing I also try to say is just like stay within your like what you are an expert on and what you feel like you have most expertise in. Using the models to help you do that type of thing, I think is really, really helpful. And especially if you feel like you're blocked. So that would be my main thing. I just think though that like, just trying out this stuff is the first step. Like I kind of like try to avoid doing like vibe coding and that type of thing because I think it causes me to not have the right viewpoint from a product manager standpoint. I think it's actually putting you back into this like I'm an engineer mindset, I think is bad for product managers because I don't think the goal is that everybody becomes an engineer. Right. I don't think that's right. I think we need to have different viewpoints that are still thinking about things. And so what I would say is like, I do try this out though. Right. And so even just the other day, I needed to update some documentation. So tried out like using a coding agent to update that documentation. And it didn't work exactly the way I wanted at first. I had to fix some things, but it did okay. And actually something that it also helped me do is that when I saw how it actually updated the documentation, it made me think about how I actually really wanted the documentation to look. So I think this idea of using the models as a way to critique your work, like adversarial, like types of things. We have like one tool called Bloom, which helps give early feedback to PMs about their initiatives. And one of the commenters that they have in there is that the PMs really find funny is this like super rude, sarcastic prompt, which is basically saying why this is a bad idea. And the thing that's really valuable about it is that it's critiquing the person's thinking, right, in some way, but it's doing it in such a way that is like it doesn't hurt because it's not another person. There's no reputational risk of that they think I'm stupid, right? It's a bot, and so I don't care what the bot thinks, but the bot is actually saying things that I I should actually be aware of and I should have answers for. And then the opposite side of this is not only, so like I'm getting critique from these things, it's critiquing my ideas, but then also when it creates like a straw man or a draft of something, I'm able to use my expertise to critique it in the way that it has done things. And so do I need to add more context? Do I need to just change it? Like, am I using this as a first draft and then editing it myself? I think using those two models is really, really helpful for people. And I think we're going to start to implement these things more and more. Like even for reporting is a good example of like, the tools we have right now can go and look like a project board, pull out all of the updates, give it to you in a very nicely formatted way. One of the things we started to do a better and better job of is like, where are there gaps in this information and actually highlighting that, right? Like where are there missing updates, or what is like, where is there an update that's just like a bad update and you should tell that person to like redo the update, right? Like that's super helpful. And then as like, I also, as a person that then needs to pass this information on to a leader, I, as a human, shape that information. So a good example of that type of thing is not only just like the wording, like I think this person will care about that thing, or this is like a trigger word for this person that will get them like too involved. But even things like red, yellow, green status is actually a human decision. And the reason why is because we could build a rubric for like that. If it's 80% done, we're green, right? OKRs try to do this with like the KR aspect of it. But the reality is like that red, yellow, green is actually a signal to the senior leader about whether they should get involved or not. And that is something that is really at the human decision-making level. So like there may be something that is red inside of our team, like we feel like we're blocked, but we feel like we can get unblocked without the leader that is above us actually intervening or being escalated to. And so we will mark it as yellow. And so those are like very important kind of nuanced aspects of this too. So that's what I'd say is like getting started is really just about like understanding the patterns of which you can use these tools and then where and how they're actually helpful in some way. So that's kind of my advice. I feel like that's a very long answer for your question, but that's how I've been thinking about it.
I appreciate it, Chris. Chris, I'm going to finish up back where we started in the world of science fiction. I was really interested to see you've got this passion for science fiction writing. Can I ask, how has that storytelling you mentioned shaped the way that you lead, and how might other product managers borrow from that craft, do you think?
I think more than anything, it's tried to teach me how to write better. Just like in a way that is engaging. And I definitely am not like, I'm not a professional writer. I mean, I guess I technically am because I've been rejected by a publication and I've been paid for writing. So I guess that means I'm technically a writer at this point. But I would just say like the idea of telling a story is really important. And I think sometimes we just kind of phone it in, right? Like with a lot of the documentation we write. I think one of the things that I've started to find really helpful is I feel like I'm actually a better speaker and storyteller than I am a writer. And so I've been starting to use tools to like, where I'll just kind of do word vomit of like everything I'm thinking about something and get help organizing this, engaging and interesting, and then using help critique this. I would say like even in science fiction writing, for example, or role-playing game writing, a lot of the time, what you really need is you need kind of like a thought partner that will throw out a bunch of stuff. And then the things that are most kind of like bright for you end up being the parts that you can integrate into your work. So for one of the science fiction stories I wrote, which was, it was called Return to the Apocalypse, which is about a future where, the world ended, except basically those offices like Google or Meta were so automated they continued to kind of like hum along. And so people that had employee badges could still eat but couldn't sleep there because the bots would like kick them out for work-life balance and stuff like that. But like coming up with like the ideas of what would you be able to make with food out of like a snack bar inside of a startup. It was really hard. Like it could have been very hard for me to think about, but like once I started working with a model, it was able to come up with lots of ideas. And we came up with this idea of like beef jerky Wellington as like something that this person would create. And so, it came up with lots of bad ideas too. But I would say like, I think that's really science fiction writing to me is often like trying to expand what is possible and then also be surprising and interesting in the way that we do this. And a lot of the time using these tools helps you kind of at least explore more, like more than I would have otherwise, I would argue. And so that's me, that's probably the biggest value of like science fiction writing is just trying to be better at writing. Now, I don't achieve it all the time at all, but I think that's the goal, is that usually a science fiction piece, especially a short story, has to be very punchy. It has to be well polished. It has to flow in a way that is interesting for people. And I would say that like, that's something we should be doing with our day-to-day writing as well. And these AI tools, I think, can help us do that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. I think a key point I've taken away is, for me, is as a CPO, thinking about this almost anti-J thinking GPT.
Yeah.
That is because I've been through that experience of, for instance, turning up in front of investors, VCs, and you
Yeah.
do a pitch and they hate everything about it, and you can't answer the questions, and you feel like you're mumbling your way through. But the challenges that come out of those bad sessions make the great sessions great. And I
That's
think
right.
with these tools available, there's too much nodding,
Yeah.
in a positive nod, and
Yeah.
too much vertical nodding and not enough horizontal nodding coming out of these
That's right.
GPTs.
Yeah. I mean,
Feel great,
we're,
but isn't producing us to be our best selves.
that's right. I think we're benefited through adversarial feedback because of the fact that like it helps us remove some of the biases that might not be helpful. And we can't see our own biases. That's one of the biggest problems, right? Is like, and that's why I think like things like randomness or non-deterministic systems like LLMs actually help us break out of this. And so I find that to be super valuable.
No, so another thing is sometimes when you get that critique from a machine instead of a human, you process that differently as well,
Yeah,
because
you do.
you're not assuming there's some biases wrapped up with that person, their political opinions, their political capital they got within the organization. You're taking it at face value. So lots to learn from you. Right.
And it doesn't hurt, right? It doesn't hurt as much because we really care about what other people think about us. And that's why like really good feedback from another person often hurts a little bit. It's not meant to like injure you, but it's meant to like upset or upturn like the things that you believe right now. I think from a machine, it's much easier to accept that in some way. And so I think there's like some benefits about both human feedback and kind of adversarial machine feedback in some way.
Last question for you, Chris, is you can only watch one science fiction movie for the rest of your life. What are you going to pick?
It's a tough one. I was going to say RoboCop is just the top of mind for me. But yeah, it would be either RoboCop or Running Man. Those are the two that I really love.
Nice. Those 80 glory days. There's plenty of music playing in the background. Love it. Fantastic. This has been an absolute pleasure of a conversation, Chris. I really appreciate you coming in, sharing some war stories, some experiences, some thoughts around what the future is going to bring for us all. So a big thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to everyone listening into this podcast episode. I hope you've enjoyed my time with Chris. I certainly feel I'm in a fortunate position to get to ask some questions for Chris today. If you'd like to learn more about Product Coalition, you can head over to productcoalition.com. Until next episode, thank you very much. Cheers.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of the Product Coalition podcast, hosted by Jay Stansel. Got questions or want to explore more topics? Connect with Jay on LinkedIn or join the ever-growing Product Coalition community on Substack. Thanks for listening.